Question 1. Benchmark analysis indicates that during a flight instructor airplane practical test, a student pilot is demonstrating a normal takeoff. The instructor observes the student initiating the takeoff roll with a slight but noticeable drift off the runway centerline, which is not being corrected promptly. What is the most appropriate instructor action to ensure adherence to regulatory standards and safe training practices? Option A. Allow the takeoff to continue, verbally coaching the student to correct the drift as the speed increases, and address the technique during the post-flight debrief. Option B. Immediately abort the takeoff by applying brakes and rudder to bring the aircraft to a stop on the runway, then instruct the student on proper centerline alignment before attempting another takeoff. Option C. Continue the takeoff, but focus the student's attention on airspeed and attitude, assuming minor centerline deviations are acceptable during the initial acceleration phase. Option D. Initiate a go-around maneuver once airborne if the deviation is still significant, and then discuss proper alignment during the subsequent circuit. Correct answer is A. Allow the takeoff to continue, verbally coaching the student to correct the drift as the speed increases, and address the technique during the post-flight debrief. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the instructor to balance the immediate need for efficient training with the paramount importance of safety and regulatory compliance during a critical phase of flight. The instructor must not only demonstrate proficiency in various takeoff techniques, but also instill a deep understanding of the underlying principles and regulatory requirements in the student. The pressure to complete training objectives within a given time frame can sometimes lead to shortcuts, making adherence to strict procedures crucial. The correct approach involves the instructor meticulously demonstrating and explaining the proper runway alignment procedures for a normal takeoff, emphasizing the importance of maintaining centerline control throughout the takeoff roll and initial climb. This aligns with the fundamental principles of safe aircraft operation and is directly supported by regulations requiring pilots to maintain aircraft control. The instructor's role is to ensure the student understands and can execute these procedures safely and effectively, adhering to all applicable FARs, Federal Aviation Regulations, concerning takeoff operations. An incorrect approach would be to rush the runway alignment, perhaps by allowing the student to initiate the takeoff roll without precise alignment, assuming minor deviations would be corrected during the roll. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for maintaining control of the aircraft from the moment the takeoff roll begins and compromises the safety margin. Another incorrect approach would be to neglect to explain the rationale behind precise alignment, focusing solely on the physical act. This undermines the educational objective of the flight instructor, failing to impart the critical why behind the procedure, which is essential for developing a safe and competent pilot. A third incorrect approach would be to deviate from the standard takeoff technique without a clear and justifiable reason, such as adverse weather or aircraft performance limitations, and without thoroughly briefing the student on the modified procedure and its associated risks. This demonstrates poor judgment and a failure to adhere to established best practices and regulatory guidance for normal operations. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic approach. First, identify the specific training objective and the relevant regulatory requirements. Second, assess the current conditions and aircraft performance. Third, plan and brief the maneuver, including potential hazards and mitigation strategies. Fourth, execute the maneuver with precision and constant vigilance, providing clear and timely instruction to the student. And finally, debrief the student, reinforcing correct procedures and addressing any errors or misunderstandings. The instructor must always prioritize safety and regulatory compliance over expediency. Question 2. The review process indicates that during a flight training session focused on cross-country navigation, a student pilot expresses a strong preference for learning only GPS navigation, stating they want to just follow the moving map. As the flight instructor, how should you best address this situation to ensure comprehensive aeronautical knowledge and safe operational capability? Option A. Agree to focus the remainder of the flight solely on GPS navigation, demonstrating its features and how to follow the moving map, as requested by the student. Option B. Politely decline the student's request and insist on spending the entire flight practicing only pilotage and dead reckoning, without any mention of GPS. Option C. Explain the limitations of GPS and the importance of backup methods, but then proceed to spend the majority of the flight demonstrating GPS functionality as the primary focus. Option D. Acknowledge the student's interest in GPS, but immediately pivot to a discussion and practical demonstration of pilotage and dead reckoning techniques, explaining their critical importance as backup methods. The correct answer is D. Acknowledge the student's interest in GPS, but immediately pivot to a discussion and practical demonstration of pilotage and dead reckoning techniques, explaining their critical importance as backup methods. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the instructor to balance the student's immediate desire for a specific navigation method with the fundamental requirement of ensuring comprehensive understanding and safe operational capability. The instructor must assess the student's proficiency beyond just the requested method, considering potential over-reliance on a single tool and the broader implications for flight safety and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in guiding the student towards a robust understanding of navigation principles rather than simply fulfilling a request. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves acknowledging the student's interest in GPS, but immediately pivoting to a discussion that emphasizes the foundational principles of pilotage and dead reckoning as essential backups. This is justified by FAA regulations, specifically 14 CFR 61, 195, A2, which mandates that flight instructors must teach the aeronautical knowledge and skills required for the certificate or rating for which the student is training. This includes a thorough understanding of various navigation methods, their limitations, and the ability to use them effectively, especially when primary electronic systems might fail. Emphasizing pilotage and dead reckoning ensures the student develops the critical thinking and practical skills necessary for safe navigation under all conditions, aligning with the FAA's overarching goal of pilot proficiency and safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that solely focuses on demonstrating GPS functionality without reinforcing pilotage or dead reckoning fails to meet the regulatory requirement of teaching comprehensive aeronautical knowledge. It risks creating a pilot who is overly dependent on technology and lacks the fundamental skills to navigate if GPS becomes unavailable due to signal loss, equipment malfunction, or jamming. This directly contravenes the spirit and letter of 14 CFR 61, 195. 2. By not adequately preparing the student for all potential operational scenarios, an approach that dismisses the student's interest in GPS entirely and insists only on traditional methods without acknowledging the role of modern technology is also professionally deficient. While foundational skills are paramount, ignoring the practical application and integration of GPS, a widely used and approved navigation system, would be a disservice to the student's overall training and readiness for modern aviation. It fails to provide a balanced perspective on navigation tools. An approach that agrees to focus exclusively on GPS without any discussion of its limitations or backup methods is the most dangerous. This creates a significant safety risk by fostering a false sense of security and potentially leading to a critical navigation error if the GPS system fails. It is a direct violation of the instructor's duty to ensure the student can operate safely under all foreseeable circumstances, as mandated by FAA regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the student's request and underlying motivation. 2. Assessing the student's current proficiency and knowledge gaps. 3. Integrating the request within the broader scope of required aeronautical knowledge and skills as defined by regulations. 4. Prioritizing foundational principles and backup methods before introducing or reinforcing advanced technologies. 5. Clearly communicating the rationale behind the instructional approach, emphasizing safety and regulatory requirements. 6. Ensuring a balanced understanding of all available tools and their respective strengths and weaknesses. Question 3. The efficiency study reveals that during a training flight focusing on turning flight, a student pilot consistently overbanks the aircraft and fails to maintain altitude during a 360-degree turn. The flight instructor observes that the student is not coordinating the turn effectively, leading to a condition where the aircraft is not flying in a stable, coordinated manner. The instructor needs to address the student's understanding of how lift, angle of attack, and load factor interact during a turn to maintain both altitude and coordinated flight. Which of the following instructional approaches best addresses the student's aerodynamic misconception and promotes safe, effective flight? Option A. The instructor suggests that the student might be experiencing a general lack of coordination or a potential issue with the aircraft's controls, rather than a specific misunderstanding of turning aerodynamics. Option B. The instructor focuses on the visual cue of the slip indicator, instructing the student to keep the ball in the middle to achieve a coordinated turn, without delving into the underlying aerodynamic forces. Option C. The instructor tells the student to simply use more rudder to correct the uncoordinated turn and maintain altitude, without further explanation of the aerodynamic principles involved. Option D. The instructor explains that in a coordinated turn, a component of lift provides the centripetal force, and to maintain altitude, the total lift must be increased by increasing the angle of attack, which consequently increases the load factor. The instructor then guides the student to correct the overbanking by reducing bank angle and to coordinate the turn using rudder and aileron in harmony, ensuring the aircraft remains in a stable, coordinated flight path. The correct answer is D. The instructor explains that in a coordinated turn, a component of lift provides the centripetal force, and to maintain altitude, the total lift must be increased by increasing the angle of attack, which consequently increases the load factor. The instructor then guides the student to correct the overbanking by reducing bank angle and to coordinate the turn using rudder and aileron in harmony, ensuring the aircraft remains in a stable, coordinated flight path. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the flight instructor to assess a student's understanding of fundamental aerodynamic principles in a practical context, specifically relating to turning flight and its associated aerodynamic forces. The instructor must not only identify the student's misconception, but also correct it effectively and safely, adhering to regulatory standards for flight instruction. The core challenge lies in translating theoretical knowledge of lift, drag, thrust, and weight into a real-world maneuver, particularly when introducing the complexities of load factor and the potential for slips or skids. The correct approach involves the instructor accurately identifying that the student is overbanking and not coordinating the turn, leading to an uncoordinated condition. The instructor should then explain that in a coordinated turn, the aircraft's lift vector is tilted, and a component of lift acts as the centripetal force. To maintain altitude, an increase in total lift is required, which is achieved by increasing the angle of attack, thereby increasing the load factor. This directly relates to the principles of turning flight and stability. The instructor must then guide the student to correct the overbanking by reducing bank angle and to coordinate the turn using rudder and aileron in harmony, ensuring the aircraft remains in a stable, coordinated flight path. This aligns with the FAA's emphasis on safe and effective flight instruction, ensuring students understand the underlying aerodynamic principles and can apply them to maintain aircraft control. An incorrect approach would be to simply tell the student to use more rudder, without explaining the aerodynamic consequences or the relationship to the angle of attack and load factor. This fails to address the student's fundamental misunderstanding of how lift is managed in a turn and how to maintain coordinated flight. It is a superficial correction that does not build a robust understanding. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the visual aspect of the turn, such as keeping the ball in the middle, without explaining the aerodynamic forces at play. While a slip indicator is a tool, relying on it without understanding the underlying aerodynamics of why the ball moves is a failure of instructional depth. This approach does not teach the student the why behind the maneuver, hindering their ability to adapt to different situations. A further incorrect approach would be to attribute the student's difficulty to a mechanical issue with the aircraft or a lack of general piloting skill, rather than a specific aerodynamic principle. This deflects from the instructional responsibility to diagnose and correct a conceptual misunderstanding of aerodynamics in turning flight. It is a failure to properly assess the student's knowledge and skill gaps. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic approach. First, observe and identify the specific behavior or error. Second, diagnose the underlying cause, linking the observed behavior to fundamental aerodynamic principles or regulatory requirements. Third, explain the correct principle and its application clearly and concisely, using appropriate terminology. Fourth, provide guided practice and feedback, allowing the student to demonstrate understanding and proficiency. Finally, reinforce the learning by relating it to other flight maneuvers or scenarios. Question 4. Assessment of a student pilot's condition during a cross-country flight when they report feeling increasingly dizzy, nauseous, and experiencing visual disturbances, stating, I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm starting to feel really off. Option A. Ask the student to describe their symptoms in more detail and attempt to diagnose the specific aeromedical factor while continuing the flight. Option B. Encourage the student to push through the discomfort, explaining that such feelings are common at altitude and can be overcome with practice, and continue the flight. Option C. Advise the student to focus on their breathing and try to relax, suggesting the symptoms may be due to mild stress or fatigue, and continue the flight to the intended destination. Option D. Immediately initiate a descent to a lower altitude and divert to the nearest suitable airport to land as soon as practicable. The correct answer is D. Immediately initiate a descent to a lower altitude and divert to the nearest suitable airport to land as soon as practicable. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a flight instructor because it requires immediate and accurate assessment of a student pilot's physical and mental state in a dynamic environment. The instructor must balance the student's desire to continue flying with the paramount responsibility for safety, which includes recognizing and mitigating aeromedical risks. The challenge lies in distinguishing between minor discomfort and a potentially incapacitating condition, and in making a sound judgment call that prioritizes the student's well-being and the safety of the flight, even if it means curtailing the lesson prematurely. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing the student pilot's well-being and flight safety by immediately assessing the reported symptoms. This aligns with the instructor's duty of care and the regulatory framework's emphasis on ensuring a pilot is medically fit to fly. Specifically, Federal Aviation Regulations, FAR, such as 14 CFR 61, 56, Flight Review, and 14 CFR 91, 13, Careless or Reckless Operation, implicitly require instructors to ensure their students are not incapacitated or posing a risk due to aeromedical factors. The instructor must recognize that symptoms like dizziness, nausea, and visual disturbances can be indicative of serious conditions such as hypoxia or spatial disorientation, which can rapidly lead to loss of control. Therefore, the most prudent action is to land as soon as practicable to allow for a proper evaluation. This proactive approach prevents potential escalation of the condition and ensures the student does not continue to fly while impaired. Incorrect approach is analysis. Continuing the flight with the student experiencing symptoms of dizziness, nausea, and visual disturbances is an unacceptable approach. This directly contravenes the instructor's responsibility to ensure the student is medically fit to fly and could lead to a violation of 14 CFR 91, 13, as it constitutes operating an aircraft in a careless or reckless manner. The symptoms described are classic indicators of potential hypoxia or spatial disorientation, both of which can lead to incapacitation and a loss of aircraft control. Ignoring these symptoms or downplaying their significance is a failure to exercise professional judgment and uphold the highest safety standards. Attempting to diagnose the specific aeromedical factor without landing and further assessment is also an incorrect approach. While the instructor may suspect hypoxia or spatial disorientation, a definitive diagnosis cannot be made in flight, especially under pressure. The priority is to mitigate the immediate risk. Delaying a landing to wait and see if the symptoms improve is a dangerous gamble with flight safety. The instructor's role is to identify potential risks and take immediate action to neutralize them, not to perform in-flight medical diagnostics. Encouraging the student to push through the discomfort and continue the lesson is a severe dereliction of duty. This approach prioritizes the completion of the lesson over the student's health and safety, which is ethically and regulatorily unsound. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the potential severity of aeromedical factors and a failure to adhere to the fundamental principles of aviation safety. Such an action could have catastrophic consequences. Professional reasoning. When faced with a student exhibiting symptoms that could indicate an aeromedical factor, a flight instructor must employ a systematic decision-making process. This process begins with immediate recognition of the potential risk. The instructor should then assess the severity and nature of the symptoms, considering the potential underlying causes such as hypoxia, spatial disorientation, or other physiological stressors. The overriding principle is to err on the side of caution. The instructor must then take decisive action to mitigate the risk, which in most cases involving significant symptoms will involve landing as soon as practicable. This decision should be communicated clearly and calmly to the student, explaining the rationale based on safety. Post-flight, The instructor should encourage the student to seek appropriate medical evaluation if the symptoms persist or are concerning. This framework emphasizes proactive risk management and the non-negotiable priority of flight safety and the well-being of the student. Question 5. Upon reviewing the pre-flight documentation for an upcoming instructional flight, a student pilot expresses concern that the aircraft's logbook entries for the last maintenance check appear incomplete, specifically regarding a recent avionics repair. The student is eager to fly and suggests that it's probably fine and they can just deal with it if any issues arise. As the flight instructor, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Thoroughly review the logbook entries yourself, consult with maintenance personnel if necessary, and delay the flight until all concerns about the avionics repair are fully resolved and documented. Option B. Assure the student that logbook entries are usually accurate and proceed with the flight, advising the student to be extra vigilant during the flight. Option C. Proceed with the flight as planned, focusing on the weather briefing and flight planning, and address the logbook concern after the flight. Option D. Delegate the responsibility of verifying the logbook entries to the student, trusting their judgment that it is likely not a significant issue. Correct answer is A. Thoroughly review the logbook entries yourself, consult with maintenance personnel if necessary, and delay the flight until all concerns about the avionics repair are fully resolved and documented. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the flight instructor to balance the student's eagerness with the paramount importance of safety and regulatory compliance. The instructor must make a judgment call that prioritizes adherence to established procedures over accommodating a student's desire to proceed. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all pre-flight requirements are met to the highest standard, preventing potential hazards. The correct approach involves a thorough and systematic review of all pre-flight documentation and a clear communication of any discrepancies or necessary actions to the student. This upholds the instructor's responsibility to ensure the aircraft is airworthy, the flight is properly planned, and all crew members, in this case, the instructor and student pilot, are aware of and prepared for the conditions. Specifically, the instructor must ensure that the aircraft inspection is complete and satisfactory, weight and balance calculations are accurate, performance data is reviewed, the weather briefing is current and understood, the flight plan is filed appropriately, comprehensive risk assessment has been conducted, and both the pre-flight briefing and passenger briefing, if applicable, are thorough. This aligns with the fundamental principles of aviation safety and the regulatory requirements for flight instruction, emphasizing that safety is non-negotiable. An incorrect approach that overlooks or dismisses the student's concerns about the aircraft inspection, assuming it's a minor issue, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of diligence in verifying the aircraft's airworthiness, which is a direct violation of the instructor's duty of care and regulatory mandates. Similarly, proceeding with the flight without a complete understanding of the weather forecast or without conducting a proper risk assessment, even if the student is eager, constitutes a failure to adhere to established safety protocols. This could lead to an unsafe situation where the flight crew is unprepared for potential hazards. Another incorrect approach would be to rush through the pre-flight briefing or skip crucial elements, such as discussing emergency procedures or the flight plan, under the guise of saving time. This compromises the student's preparedness and safety. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance above all else. This framework involves 1. Identifying the core objectives safe and effective flight instruction. 2. Gathering all relevant information aircraft status, weather flight plan, student readiness. 3. Evaluating potential risks and hazards. 4. Considering all applicable regulations and best practices. 5. Making a decision that minimizes risk and maximizes safety, even if it means delaying or modifying the flight. 6. Communicating the decision and the rationale clearly to all involved parties. Question 6. Cost-benefit analysis shows that attempting a challenging takeoff performance maneuver in a high-density altitude environment with a student pilot could potentially enhance the student's understanding of aircraft limitations. However, considering the inherent risks, what is the most professionally responsible approach for a flight instructor? Option A. Proceed with the maneuver as planned, trusting the student's enthusiasm and the aircraft's general capabilities, as the learning experience is paramount. Option B. Rely on previous experience with similar aircraft and conditions, assuming the current situation will present no new challenges. Option C. Attempt the maneuver with a modified approach, hoping that the student will learn from any minor difficulties encountered. Option D. Conduct a thorough pre-flight performance calculation and assessment, considering all environmental factors and the student's demonstrated proficiency, and make a conservative decision based on the findings. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough pre-flight performance calculation and assessment, considering all environmental factors and the student's demonstrated proficiency, and make a conservative decision based on the findings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a flight instructor to balance the student's desire for a challenging flight with the paramount responsibility of ensuring safety. The instructor must assess the student's proficiency, the aircraft's capabilities under specific environmental conditions, and the potential risks associated with pushing performance limits. Misjudging these factors can lead to a dangerous situation, potentially resulting in an accident. The instructor's judgment directly impacts the student's learning experience and, more importantly, their safety. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough pre-flight assessment of all performance-limiting factors, including density, altitude, aircraft weight, and wind conditions, and then making a conservative decision based on the student's demonstrated proficiency and the aircraft's limitations. This aligns with the fundamental duty of a flight instructor to prioritize safety above all else, as mandated by regulations such as 14 CFR 61-195A-2, which requires instructors to ensure that students are properly prepared and have the necessary knowledge and skills to safely pilot an aircraft. A conservative decision, even if it means foregoing a more ambitious maneuver, is ethically sound and legally defensible. Incorrect approach is analysis. Choosing to proceed with a demanding maneuver without a comprehensive pre-flight assessment of performance factors demonstrates a failure to adhere to basic aviation safety principles and regulatory requirements. This approach disregards the potential for unexpected performance degradation due to density, altitude, or other environmental factors, creating an unacceptable risk. It also fails to adequately consider the student's current skill level, potentially leading to a situation beyond their control. Attempting the maneuver solely because the student expresses a strong desire to do so, without an independent, objective assessment of the risks and aircraft performance, is a critical ethical and regulatory failure. The instructor's role is to guide and educate, not to be swayed by a student's enthusiasm at the expense of safety. This approach prioritizes student satisfaction over safety, which is contrary to the core responsibilities of a flight instructor. Deciding to proceed based on past successful attempts in similar conditions, without re-evaluating current conditions and the student's specific performance on that day, is also a dangerous oversight. Aviation is dynamic, and each flight presents unique circumstances. Relying on past experience without current validation ignores the potential for subtle but significant changes in performance envelopes, wind, or aircraft condition, thereby increasing risk. Professional reasoning. Flight instructors must employ a systematic risk management process. This involves identifying potential hazards, e.g., high-density altitude, strong crosswind, student fatigue, assessing the associated risks, and implementing control measures to mitigate those risks. This process should be continuous throughout the flight. When faced with a decision that involves pushing performance limits, the instructor should always err on the side of caution. If there is any doubt about the aircraft's ability to perform safely or the student's ability to handle the situation, the maneuver should be modified or postponed. This proactive and conservative approach is the hallmark of professional aviation instruction. Question 7. Performance analysis shows that during the final approach to landing in a single-engine airplane, the student pilot is focused on maintaining airspeed and altitude. As the aircraft descends through 500 feet AGL, the instructor observes a rapidly developing cumulonimbus cloud formation approximately 2 miles to the left of the runway, accompanied by visible lightning. The student has not yet noticed the developing weather. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the flight instructor to take? Option A. Advise the student to deviate from the approach path to fly around the developing storm while continuing the descent. Option B. Immediately divert the flight to the nearest suitable alternate airport. Option C. Instruct the student to maintain the approach and attempt to land quickly before the storm reaches the airport. Option D. Announce go around and take control of the aircraft to execute a go around. The correct answer is D. Announce go around and take control of the aircraft to execute a go around. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for flight instructors, balancing student learning objectives with the paramount responsibility of ensuring flight safety, especially when encountering unexpected weather phenomena. The instructor must not only assess the immediate weather threat, but also evaluate the student's decision-making capabilities and their understanding of weather-related risks. The challenge lies in determining the most appropriate course of action that prioritizes safety while still providing a valuable learning experience, without compromising regulatory requirements. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing safety by immediately assessing the developing thunderstorm's proximity and intensity, and then making a go-around decision. This aligns directly with the FAA's emphasis on the piloting command's responsibility for the safety of the flight, as outlined in 14 CFR 91.3. Specifically, 14 CFR 91.103 requires per-flight action to include a study of available weather reports and forecasts, and 14 CFR 91.155 basic VFR weather minimums, and 14 CFR 91.157 special VFR weather minimums provide guidance on operating in VFR conditions, which are clearly being compromised by the developing thunderstorm. The instructor's duty as a certificated flight instructor, CFI, under 14 CFR 61.195 includes ensuring that students are trained in safe aircraft operation, which inherently means avoiding hazardous weather. A go-around is a standard procedure to avoid an immediate hazard, and in this context, it demonstrates sound judgment and adherence to safety protocols. Incorrect approaches analysis. Continuing the approach with the intention of landing quickly is a failure to adhere to the principle of see and avoid, and the proactive avoidance of hazardous weather. Thunderstorms pose significant risks including severe turbulence, lightning, hail, and microbursts, all of which can be catastrophic, especially during the critical phases of takeoff and landing. This approach violates the spirit and letter of 14 CFR 91.103 by not adequately considering the implications of the observed weather on the flight's safety. Attempting to fly around the storm while maintaining the approach path is also a dangerous compromise. While avoiding a direct encounter, the aircraft may still be exposed to hazardous conditions such as strong updrafts, downdrafts, and turbulence on the periphery of the storm. This demonstrates a lack of decisive action and an underestimation of the unpredictable nature of thunderstorms, failing to meet the CFI's responsibility to ensure student safety. Diverting to an alternate airport without first assessing the immediate go-around option is an overreaction that may not be necessary and could disrupt the training syllabus unnecessarily. While diversion is a valid safety tool, the immediate threat can often be mitigated by a go-around, which allows for a more controlled assessment of the situation and a return to a safe landing environment at the original airport once the weather has passed or moved on. This approach fails to demonstrate the ability to manage immediate threats effectively. Professional reasoning. The professional decision-making process in this scenario involves a risk assessment matrix that prioritizes safety above all else. The instructor must first identify the hazard developing thunderstorm, assess its proximity and potential impact, significant turbulence, lightning, etc., and then determine the most effective mitigation strategy. In this case, the immediate threat to safe landing necessitates a decisive action. The go-around is the most appropriate immediate response, as it removes the aircraft from the hazardous zone, allowing for a safe re-evaluation of the situation and a subsequent decision on whether to continue the approach, divert, or hold. This process is guided by regulatory requirements for safe operation and the CFI's ethical obligation to protect the student and the aircraft. Question 8. Implementation of a partial panel exercise during instrument training. The student reports a wobbly attitude indicator during a simulated instrument approach. The instructor observes the indicator is indeed oscillating slightly, but the aircraft's attitude appears stable. What is the most appropriate decision-making process for the flight instructor? Option A. Immediately terminate the exercise, explain the potential instrument error, and return to the airport to have the instrument checked. Option B. Immediately take control of the aircraft, disengage the autopilot if engaged, and fly the aircraft manually to the nearest suitable airport without further instruction. Option C. Continue the partial panel exercise, instructing the student to rely on other instruments and ignore the oscillating attitude indicator, assuming it is a minor anomaly. Option D. Acknowledge the student's observation, assess the stability of the aircraft using other instruments, and if the aircraft remains stable, Guide the student through a controlled recovery using a combination of instruments and control inputs, followed by a thorough debrief. The correct answer is A. Immediately terminate the exercise, explain the potential instrument error, and return to the airport to have the instrument checked. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the flight instructor to balance the immediate need for student safety with the pedagogical goal of teaching essential instrument flying skills. The instructor must make a rapid, informed decision under pressure, considering the student's proficiency, the aircraft's capabilities, and the regulatory requirements for instrument instruction. Careful judgment is required to avoid overreacting and unnecessarily terminating the lesson, while also ensuring that the student is not placed in a situation beyond their current skill level or the aircraft's limitations. The correct approach involves a systematic assessment of the situation, prioritizing safety while adhering to the principles of effective flight instruction. This includes recognizing the limitations of the aircraft's attitude indicator, understanding the potential for instrument error, and applying appropriate recovery techniques. The instructor must then communicate clearly with the student, guiding them through the recovery process and debriefing the event to reinforce learning. This aligns with the FAA's emphasis on risk management and the instructor's responsibility to ensure the safety of flight and the proficiency of the student. As outlined in 14 CFR Part 61, an incorrect approach would be to immediately terminate the flight due to a minor instrument anomaly without attempting to assess or manage the situation. This fails to uphold the instructor's duty to provide comprehensive training and develop the student's problem-solving skills. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the student's observation or the instrument's indication without proper investigation, potentially leading to a more serious situation if the indication was valid. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to prioritize safety. A third incorrect approach would be to attempt a recovery technique that is inappropriate for the observed attitude or the aircraft's configuration, potentially exacerbating the problem. This highlights a deficiency in the instructor's knowledge of unusual attitude recovery and instrument limitations. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that involves 1. Recognize the situation. Identify the deviation or anomaly. 2. Assess the risk. Determine the potential hazards and severity. 3. Consider options. Evaluate possible courses of action based on training, regulations, and aircraft limitations. 4. Make a decision. Choose the safest and most effective course of action. 5. Implement the decision. Execute the chosen course of action. 6. Evaluate the outcome. Review the results and debrief for learning. Question 9. Which approach would be most appropriate for a flight instructor to ensure a student pilot thoroughly understands and correctly performs the pre-flight inspection of an aircraft prior to a training flight, adhering strictly to U.S. federal aviation regulations? Option A. Instruct the student to perform the pre-flight inspection from memory, as this demonstrates proficiency. Option B. Allow the student to perform a quick visual walk-around while the instructor briefly reviews the aircraft's maintenance logbook. Option C. Systematically guide the student through each item on the aircraft's pre-flight checklist, explaining the purpose of each check and observing the student's execution. Option D. Delegate the entire pre-flight inspection to the student, trusting their prior training to be sufficient. The correct answer is C. Systematically guide the student through each item on the aircraft's pre-flight checklist, explaining the purpose of each check and observing the student's execution. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for flight instructors, balancing the need for efficient training with the paramount importance of safety and regulatory compliance during ground operations. The challenge lies in ensuring the student pilot fully understands and adheres to procedures, even when under time pressure or when a seemingly minor deviation might appear inconsequential. A flight instructor must not only demonstrate correct procedures, but also instill a deep understanding of the underlying reasons for them, fostering a safety-conscious mindset in the student. The correct approach involves a deliberate and systematic pre-flight inspection, emphasizing thoroughness and adherence to the aircraft's checklist. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with federal aviation regulations, FAR, specifically 14 CFR 91.7a, which states that no person may operate an aircraft unless it is in an airworthy condition. The pre-flight inspection is the pilot's primary responsibility to ensure this condition. Furthermore, 14 CFR 61.47a requires a flight instructor to ensure that each student has the necessary knowledge and skill to safely conduct a flight. A comprehensive pre-flight inspection is a fundamental skill and a critical safety component that must be taught and reinforced. This approach prioritizes safety, regulatory compliance, and effective student training by demonstrating and explaining the importance of each step. An incorrect approach that rushes through the pre-flight inspection, relying on a quick visual scan without systematically following the checklist, fails to meet regulatory requirements and compromises safety. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and can lead to overlooked defects, violating 14 CFR 91(7)(a). It also fails to adequately train the student on the importance of a thorough inspection, potentially leading to future unsafe practices. Another incorrect approach that skips certain inspection items deemed less critical by the instructor, even if the aircraft appears outwardly sound, is also unacceptable. This is a subjective judgment that bypasses the established safety protocols and the comprehensive nature of the checklist, which is designed to catch a wide range of potential issues. This violates the principle of ensuring airworthiness and fails to instill a disciplined approach in the student. A third incorrect approach that delegates the entire pre-flight inspection to the student without active instructor oversight or explanation of each step is also flawed. While empowering the student is important, the instructor's role is to teach and ensure understanding. Without proper guidance and verification, the student may not perform the inspection correctly or understand its significance, again failing to meet the instructor's responsibilities under 14 CFR 61(47)(a). The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves prioritizing safety and regulatory compliance above all else. Instructors should always adhere to established procedures and checklists, using them as teaching tools. They must actively engage the student in the process, explaining the rationale behind each step and verifying the student's understanding and execution. When time constraints arise, the instructor should adjust the training schedule rather than compromising safety or procedural integrity. Question 10. The analysis reveals that during a steep turn maneuver practice session, a student pilot who has expressed eagerness to progress quickly consistently exhibits a tendency to overbank and lose altitude, indicating a lack of precise control. The flight instructor recognizes the student's enthusiasm, but is concerned about the safety implications of this recurring error. The instructor must decide how to address this situation to ensure the student achieves the required proficiency without discouraging them. Which of the following approaches best upholds the instructor's professional and regulatory responsibilities? Option A. Immediately terminate the steep turn practice and inform the student that they are not ready for such maneuvers, requiring them to restart the entire training syllabus. Option B. Conduct a thorough debrief, clearly explaining the specific control inputs and visual cues required for a safe and precise steep turn, outlining a plan for targeted practice to correct the observed deficiencies. Option C. Acknowledge the student's effort and suggest they get a feel for it during future practice, focusing on other maneuvers for the remainder of the lesson. Option D. Advise the student that while the steep turn needs improvement, their overall progress is satisfactory, and proceed with signing them off for the practical test, assuming they will correct the issue independently. The correct answer is C. Acknowledge the student's effort and suggest they get a feel for it during future practice, focusing on other maneuvers for the remainder of the lesson. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a flight instructor due to the inherent conflict between a student's perceived progress and the instructor's responsibility to ensure safety and adherence to regulatory standards. The instructor must balance encouraging the student with upholding the integrity of flight training and the safety of flight operations. Careful judgment is required to address the student's overconfidence without demotivating them, while ensuring all required maneuvers are mastered to a safe standard. The correct approach involves a direct, yet constructive, conversation with the student about the specific deficiencies observed during the steep turn. This approach prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance by ensuring the student understands the critical nature of precise control during this maneuver. The instructor should clearly articulate the observed deviations from proper technique, referencing the standards expected for a pilot operating under the relevant regulations. This aligns with the instructor's duty to provide thorough and safe instruction, as mandated by regulations governing flight training and pilot certification. Ethically, it is the instructor's responsibility to ensure the student is not only proficient, but also safe to operate an aircraft, even if it means delaying a sign-off or requiring additional practice. An incorrect approach would be to overlook the student's errors due to a desire to please them or to avoid confrontation. This failure to address the deficiencies directly violates the instructor's ethical obligation to ensure the student's competence and safety. It also contravenes regulatory requirements that mandate proficiency in all areas of training before a student can be recommended for a practical test. Another incorrect approach is to be overly harsh or dismissive of the student's efforts. While directness is necessary, a lack of empathy or constructive feedback can be demotivating and counterproductive to the learning process, potentially leading to resentment and a breakdown in the instructor-student relationship, which, while not a direct regulatory violation, undermines the effectiveness of the training. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance above all else. This involves 1. Objective assessment of performance against established standards. 2. Clear and honest communication of findings to the student, focusing on specific behaviors and their implications. 3. Development of a remedial training plan tailored to address identified weaknesses. 4. Maintaining professional integrity by refusing to compromise standards for convenience or to avoid difficult conversations. Question 11. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a student pilot, working towards their private pilot certificate, expresses a strong desire to practice maneuvers within the lateral boundaries of a nearby Class B airspace during their next lesson. The student believes they have a good understanding of the area and the required procedures. The flight instructor is aware that the student has not yet received the specific endorsement for operating in Class B airspace, nor has the aircraft been recently flown into such airspace to confirm its systems are fully operational for that environment. The instructor also notes that the aircraft's logbook indicates the next scheduled inspection is not for another 50 hours, but the aircraft has been performing nominally. Which of the following approaches best represents professional flight instruction and regulatory compliance? Option A. Proceed with the flight, but remain outside the lateral boundaries of the Class B airspace, performing maneuvers in the adjacent Class G airspace, and inform the student that they can practice in Class B once they have the endorsement. Option B. Attempt to obtain a last-minute clearance from Air Traffic Control Act to enter Class B airspace without the student having the required endorsement, relying on the instructor's presence to ensure safety. Option C. Proceed with the flight into Class B airspace, as the student's familiarity with the area and the instructor's supervision will mitigate any risks, and the aircraft's performance has been satisfactory. Option D. Decline the flight into Class B airspace for this lesson, explaining to the student that the necessary endorsement and a pre-flight confirmation of the aircraft's suitability for Class B operations are required, and suggest alternative training areas that comply with current limitations. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the flight into Class B airspace, as the student's familiarity with the area and the instructor's supervision will mitigate any risks, and the aircraft's performance has been satisfactory. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the flight instructor to balance student learning objectives with strict adherence to regulatory requirements, specifically concerning airspace and aircraft operational limitations. The instructor must make a judgment call that prioritizes safety and compliance over potentially expediting a student's training or fulfilling a perceived student desire. The correct approach involves prioritizing the student's understanding and adherence to FAR Part 91, specifically regarding operations in Class B airspace and the aircraft's operational limitations. This approach is correct because FAR 91-131 mandates specific requirements for operating in Class B airspace, including a clearance from ATC and a pilot certificate with the appropriate endorsement for the specific aircraft type if it's a complex or technically advanced aircraft. Furthermore, the instructor must ensure the aircraft meets all airworthiness requirements for the intended flight, as outlined in FAR Part 91. The instructor's primary responsibility is to ensure the safety and regulatory compliance of all flights conducted under their supervision. Ethically, this means not compromising on regulations to meet student expectations or convenience. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the flight into Class B airspace without the student having the necessary endorsement or without obtaining the required ATC clearance, assuming the student's familiarity with the area is sufficient. This fails to comply with FAR 91-131 and creates a significant safety and regulatory violation. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt the flight in an aircraft that has not been properly maintained or inspected according to FAR Part 91, thereby jeopardizing airworthiness and safety. A third incorrect approach would be to dismiss the student's concerns about the aircraft's operational limitations, assuming the instructor's experience overrides potential mechanical issues, which is a direct violation of the instructor's duty to ensure the aircraft is airworthy and safe for flight. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic evaluation of the flight plan against all applicable FARs, including those pertaining to airspace, aircraft airworthiness, and pilot privileges. The instructor must proactively identify potential regulatory conflicts or safety concerns before the flight commences. When faced with a situation where a student's request or perceived readiness conflicts with regulations, the instructor must prioritize regulatory compliance and safety, explaining the rationale to the student to foster their understanding and respect for the rules. Question 12. The evaluation methodology shows that a student pilot has demonstrated the basic elements of a specific complex maneuver during a training flight, but the instructor observed several minor deviations from the ideal execution, and the student expressed some frustration with their performance. The instructor needs to determine the most appropriate next step to ensure the student's proficiency and readiness for further training. Which of the following approaches best reflects sound instructional practice and regulatory compliance? Option A. Conduct a brief review of the maneuver's principles, provide specific feedback on the observed deviations, and then have the student perform the maneuver again under close supervision to assess improvement. Option B. Postpone any further evaluation of this maneuver until the student expresses complete confidence and mastery, regardless of the training schedule. Option C. Endorse the student for the next stage of training, acknowledging their effort and assuming they will improve with more practice independently. Option D. Accept the student's self-assessment of their performance and move on to the next topic, as the maneuver was not a complete failure. The correct answer is C. Endorse the student for the next stage of training, acknowledging their effort and assuming they will improve with more practice independently. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for flight instructors, balancing the need for thorough student assessment with the practical constraints of limited training time and the student's desire to progress. The instructor must accurately gauge the student's proficiency in a critical maneuver, while also considering the student's emotional state and potential for anxiety, which can significantly impact performance. The professional challenge lies in making an objective assessment that is fair to the student and upholds safety standards, without being overly influenced by external pressures or personal biases. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, multifaceted evaluation that directly addresses the learning objective for the maneuver. This includes observing the student's execution, providing specific and constructive feedback, and then allowing for a supervised practice attempt with targeted guidance. This aligns with the principles of effective teaching and assessment, which emphasize clear objectives, demonstration, practice, and feedback. Regulatory frameworks, such as the FAA's Practical Test Standards, PTS, or Airman Certification Standards, ACS, implicitly require instructors to ensure students can perform maneuvers to a safe and competent standard before endorsing them for further testing. Ethically, the instructor has a duty of care to ensure the student is adequately prepared, prioritizing safety above all else. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely relying on the student's self-assessment or verbal confirmation of understanding. This fails to objectively verify the student's practical skill, which is the core requirement for demonstrating proficiency in a flight maneuver. It bypasses essential assessment techniques like direct observation and performance evaluation, potentially leading to an unsafe endorsement. Another incorrect approach is to postpone the evaluation indefinitely due to time constraints or the student's perceived anxiety. While empathy is important, delaying a necessary assessment without a clear plan for future evaluation can hinder student progress and create a false sense of readiness. It neglects the instructor's responsibility to systematically guide the student through the curriculum and ensure mastery of required skills. A third incorrect approach is to overlook minor errors in the student's execution because the overall outcome of the maneuver was acceptable. Effective flight instruction requires identifying and correcting all significant errors, not just those that prevent immediate failure. This approach fails to meet the standards of thoroughness expected in flight training and can lead to the development of bad habits. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and adherence to regulatory standards. This involves 1. Clearly defining the learning objective and the criteria for success for the specific maneuver. 2. Employing a variety of assessment techniques, including direct observation, performance analysis, and questioning, to gauge student understanding and skill. 3. Providing timely, specific, and constructive feedback. 4. Allowing for supervised practice and reevaluation as needed. 5. Documenting the assessment process and student progress. This systematic approach ensures that student evaluations are objective, comprehensive, and aligned with the requirements for safe and competent piloting. Question 13. The audit findings indicate that during a simulated instrument approach to runway 27 at a non-towered airport, the student pilot, under the supervision of a certified flight instructor, CFI, consistently struggled to maintain the prescribed glide path and airspeed, even with verbal guidance. The weather conditions are reported as marginal for visual flight, with a ceiling at 1,000 feet AGL and visibility of 3 miles. The CFI must decide on the most appropriate course of action to ensure safety and effective instruction. Option A. Continue the approach, providing more aggressive verbal coaching to help the student correct the deviations and land. Option B. Initiate a go-around immediately due to the unstable approach and marginal weather conditions. Option C. Advise the student to maintain current parameters and attempt a landing, emphasizing that some deviation is acceptable during training. Option D. Attempt to transition to a visual approach and landing based on the current instrument indications, assuming the student can see the runway. Correct answer is B. Initiate a go-around immediately due to the unstable approach and marginal weather conditions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the instructor to balance immediate safety concerns with the student's learning objectives, all while adhering to strict regulatory requirements for instrument approaches. The instructor must accurately assess the student's proficiency, the aircraft's capabilities, and the prevailing weather conditions to make a safe and effective decision. Misjudgment could lead to a hazardous situation or an incomplete learning experience. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves the instructor recognizing the student's struggle to maintain stabilized approach criteria and making a proactive decision to initiate a go-around. This aligns with the fundamental principle of aviation safety. Aviate, navigate, communicate. The instructor's primary responsibility is the safe operation of the aircraft. Initiating a go-around when the approach is not stabilized is a standard and recommended procedure to avoid potential landing hazards, such as exceeding glide path, airspeed deviations, or runway alignment issues. This decision directly supports the regulatory emphasis on maintaining safe flight parameters and preventing unsafe landing conditions. It also serves as a critical teaching moment, demonstrating to the student the importance of adhering to approach procedures and the safety net provided by a go-around. Incorrect approaches analysis. Choosing to continue the unstable approach despite the student's difficulties is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It disregards the established criteria for a stabilized approach, which are designed to prevent landing accidents. This action prioritizes completing the landing over ensuring safety, which is contrary to the instructor's duty of care. Attempting to coach the student through the unstable approach without initiating a go-around, especially if the deviations are significant, is also problematic. While instruction is key, there's a point where the safety of the flight supersedes the immediate instructional goal of landing. This could lead to the student developing poor habits or encountering a situation where the instructor's intervention is too late. Deciding to land without a clear visual reference to the runway, solely based on instrument indications, when visual conditions are marginal or deteriorating, is a dangerous practice. This blurs the lines between instrument and visual approaches and can lead to spatial disorientation or an improper landing. It violates the principle of maintaining visual contact with the intended landing environment when transitioning to a visual landing. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety above all else. This involves continuous assessment of the flight environment, aircraft performance, and pilot proficiency. When an approach becomes unstable, the immediate and safest course of action is to execute a go-around. This decision should be made decisively and without hesitation. The instructor should then debrief the student, explaining the reasons for the go-around and reinforcing the importance of stabilized approaches. This iterative process of assessment, decision-making, and feedback is crucial for developing competent and safe pilots. Question 14. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for clearer guidance on instructor intervention during advanced maneuver training. During an accelerated stall exercise in a complex aircraft, the student inadvertently enters a fully developed, unrecoverable spin. The aircraft is at a safe altitude, but the student is exhibiting signs of panic and is not executing the prescribed spin recovery procedure effectively. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the flight instructor? Option A. Attempt to recover the aircraft using a non-standard improvised control input that the instructor believes might be quicker. Option B. Immediately take control of the aircraft to execute a standard spin recovery, then rebrief the student and plan for further practice of spin entries and recoveries. Option C. Allow the student to continue attempting the spin recovery, providing verbal guidance to see if they can eventually regain control. Option D. Immediately take control of the aircraft and land as soon as possible, abandoning further spin training for the day. The correct answer is B. Immediately take control of the aircraft to execute a standard spin recovery, then rebrief the student and plan for further practice of spin entries and recoveries. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the flight instructor to balance the immediate safety of the student with the pedagogical goal of teaching effective spin recovery techniques. The instructor must accurately assess the aircraft's state, student's proficiency, and the surrounding environment to make a critical decision under pressure. Misjudging any of these factors could lead to a dangerous situation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves the instructor taking immediate control of the aircraft to arrest the spin, and then re-engaging the student in a controlled manner for a subsequent practice session. This is justified by FAA regulations, specifically 14 CFR 91, 13 careless or reckless operation, and 14 CFR 61, 195 privileges and limitations, flight instructor, while 14 CFR 61, 157 additional aircraft ratings, airplane outlines requirements for spin training. The instructor's primary responsibility is always the safety of the flight. Once a spin is unintentionally entered and becomes unrecoverable by the student, the instructor must intervene to ensure a safe outcome. After recovery, the instructor can then rebrief the student and conduct further training in a safe and controlled manner, adhering to the syllabus and ensuring the student's competency. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach where the instructor allows the student to continue attempting recovery without intervention, despite the spin becoming unrecoverable, is a direct violation of the instructor's duty of care and potentially 14 CFR 91. 13. This demonstrates a failure to prioritize safety and a lack of judgment in assessing the student's capabilities and the aircraft's condition. An approach where the instructor immediately recovers the aircraft, but then abandons the spin recovery training for the remainder of the flight, without rebriefing or planning for future practice, fails to meet the training objectives outlined in the practical test standards for the airplane instructor certificate. While safety is paramount, the instructor also has a responsibility to ensure the student achieves the required proficiency in advanced maneuvers. An approach where the instructor attempts to recover the aircraft using a non-standard or improvised technique, rather than the established and approved spin recovery procedure, is highly risky and could exacerbate the situation. This would be a failure to adhere to best practices and potentially violate the principles of safe flight operations. Professional reasoning. In situations involving advanced maneuvers and potential loss of control, a flight instructor must employ a systematic decision-making process. This involves 1. Threat and error management (TEM), identifying potential threats e.g., student entering an unrecoverable spin, and errors e.g., students' incorrect control inputs, and implementing mitigation strategies. 2. Situational awareness, continuously assessing the aircraft's attitude, altitude, airspeed, and the student's actions. 3. Risk assessment, evaluating the immediate risks to safety and the potential for recovery. 4. Decision-making, choosing the safest and most effective course of action, which may involve immediate intervention. 5. Communication, clearly communicating with the student before, during, and after the maneuver. 6. Debriefing and retraining, ensuring the learning objectives are met through thorough explanation and subsequent practice when appropriate. Question 15. Consider a scenario where a student pilot is scheduled for their practical test in 2 days and has demonstrated proficiency in most maneuvers, but exhibits a tendency to over-control during steep turns and a slight hesitation in executing a go-around from a simulated engine failure on final approach. As a flight instructor, what is the most effective and professionally responsible approach to prepare this student for the practical test? Considering risk assessment and the practical test standards, PTS. Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the PTS. Identify the specific performance standards for steep turns and go-arounds, and then engage in targeted practice sessions that simulate the conditions under which these maneuvers are performed during the test, incorporating realistic scenarios and providing detailed feedback during and after each attempt, culminating in a comprehensive post-flight debriefing. Option B. Dedicate the remaining flight time to repeated practice of steep turns and go-arounds, focusing on precise execution of the PTS criteria for these maneuvers, followed by a brief review of common errors. Option C. Focus solely on the steep turn and go-around maneuvers, drilling them repeatedly until the student can perform them perfectly, without significant emphasis on the underlying principles or the instructor's assessment of the student's overall risk management capabilities. Option D. Spend the majority of the remaining flight time on other maneuvers to ensure they are also sharp, assuming the student's current level of proficiency in steep turns and go-arounds is sufficient for the test, and briefly mention the common errors to the student. Correct answer is B. Dedicate the remaining flight time to repeated practice of steep turns and go-arounds, focusing on precise execution of the PTS criteria for these maneuvers, followed by a brief review of common errors. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the flight instructor to balance the immediate need to prepare a student for a practical test with the overarching responsibility of ensuring the student's safety and competence. The pressure of an upcoming test can lead to a temptation to cram or focus solely on passing criteria, potentially overlooking fundamental safety principles or the student's actual understanding. The instructor must make a judgment call on how to best utilize limited time to maximize both test readiness and genuine aviation proficiency. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, risk-informed preparation strategy that directly addresses the practical test standards, PTS, while prioritizing safety and understanding. This means identifying specific areas of weakness through a thorough risk assessment of the student's performance, then tailoring instruction to address those risks. This aligns with the FAA's emphasis on risk management in aviation training and the instructor's responsibility to ensure the applicant meets the standards for safe operation. The instructor should review the PTS, identify common errors associated with the maneuvers, and then conduct practice sessions that simulate test conditions, focusing on correcting those errors and reinforcing safe practices. A post-flight debriefing is crucial for reinforcing learning and identifying any remaining areas for improvement, directly contributing to the student's overall competence and safety. This methodical approach ensures that preparation is not just about passing a test, but about developing a safe and proficient pilot. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on the maneuvers listed in the PTS without assessing the student's underlying understanding or risk management skills is an incorrect approach. This can lead to rote memorization of procedures rather than true comprehension, failing to equip the student to handle unexpected situations or deviations from standard procedures, which is a critical safety failure and a violation of the instructor's duty to develop a competent pilot. Prioritizing speed and efficiency over thoroughness by rushing through maneuvers without adequate feedback or correction is another incorrect approach. This neglects the instructor's responsibility to identify and correct common errors, potentially allowing unsafe habits to develop. The PTS are designed to ensure a minimum standard of proficiency. Rushing through them undermines this standard and compromises safety. Neglecting the post-flight debriefing or treating it as a mere formality is also an incorrect approach. The debrief is a vital part of the learning process, allowing for reinforcement of correct techniques, discussion of errors, and planning for future improvement. Omitting or minimizing this step hinders the student's learning and fails to address potential lingering issues, which is a dereliction of the instructor's duty to foster continuous improvement and safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a systematic risk assessment framework. This involves 1. Understanding the objective, preparing the student for the practical test. 2. Identifying potential hazards, student skill gaps, test anxiety, time constraints. 3. Assessing the risks, likelihood and severity of errors during the test or in future operations. 4. Developing mitigation strategies, targeted instruction, practice under simulated test conditions, thorough debriefing. 5. Implementing and evaluating, conducting the training and assessing its effectiveness. This process ensures that decisions are grounded in safety and regulatory compliance, rather than solely on the immediate goal of passing the test. Question 16. Governance review demonstrates that a flight instructor is pressured by a student to endorse them for solo flight, despite the student exhibiting some nervousness and occasional minor deviations during recent practice sessions. The student expresses strong confidence in their abilities and believes they are ready. The instructor is aware that the student has a limited number of flight hours remaining before their scheduled departure for college. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the flight instructor? Option A. Conduct a thorough flight evaluation to objectively assess the student's proficiency against all regulatory requirements for solo flight. If the student meets all standards, provide the endorsement. If not, clearly explain the deficiencies to the student and provide additional training until proficiency is achieved. Option B. Endorse the student for solo flight, acknowledging their confidence in the time constraints, with the understanding that the student will be extra cautious during their solo. Option C. Advise the student that while they may not be fully ready, they can proceed with solo flight if they feel confident enough, as some level of nervousness is normal. Option D. Postpone the solo endorsement indefinitely, until the instructor is absolutely certain the student will never make any mistakes, regardless of demonstrated proficiency. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough flight evaluation to objectively assess the student's proficiency against all regulatory requirements for solo flight. If the student meets all standards, provide the endorsement. If not, clearly explain the deficiencies to the student and provide additional training until proficiency is achieved. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a student's perceived progress and the instructor's legal and ethical obligation to ensure safety and adherence to regulatory standards. The instructor must balance fostering student confidence with the non-negotiable requirement of competence and safety before solo flight. The core of the challenge lies in the instructor's responsibility as a certificating authority for the student's readiness, a role governed by strict legal mandates and ethical principles. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective assessment of the student's performance against established standards, prioritizing safety and regulatory compliance above all else. This aligns with the legal responsibility of a flight instructor to endorse a student for solo flight only when they are proficient and have met all regulatory requirements, as outlined in regulations such as 14 CFR 61/87 for student pilot limitations and solo endorsements. Ethically, this approach upholds the instructor's duty of care to the student, the public, and the aviation system by preventing an inadequately trained pilot from operating an aircraft. It also maintains professional integrity by adhering to the spirit and letter of aviation regulations. An incorrect approach that prioritizes the student's desire to solo over objective assessment fails to uphold the instructor's legal responsibility. This could lead to an unsafe situation, violating the instructor's duty to ensure the student can safely operate the aircraft. Ethically, it represents a breach of trust and a dereliction of duty, potentially leading to accidents and damage to the instructor's reputation and certificate. Another incorrect approach, such as rushing the endorsement due to time constraints or external pressure, similarly disregards the paramount importance of student proficiency and safety. This action directly contravenes the regulatory framework that mandates specific training and demonstrated proficiency before solo endorsements. It also demonstrates a lack of professional integrity and a failure to adhere to ethical standards of diligence and responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, objective evaluation. This begins with clearly understanding the regulatory requirements for the specific endorsement or action. The instructor must then objectively assess the student's performance against these standards, looking for consistent demonstration of skills and knowledge. If there is any doubt or a lack of consistent proficiency, the instructor must err on the side of caution, providing additional training and delaying the endorsement. Open and honest communication with the student about the reasons for any delay is crucial, reinforcing the instructor's commitment to their safety and long-term success as a pilot. Maintaining a clear separation between personal relationships or desires and professional judgment is also vital. Question 17. System analysis indicates that a flight instructor is tasked with developing a comprehensive flight training syllabus for a new student pursuing a private pilot certificate under FAA Part 61. The instructor needs to ensure the syllabus is effective, compliant, and adaptable. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and sound pedagogical principles for syllabus development and student progress tracking? Option A. Adopt a flexible approach where lessons are taught based on the instructor's immediate inspiration and the student's perceived understanding, without a formal syllabus or structured lesson plans. Option B. Create a syllabus that lists the minimum regulatory maneuvers and knowledge topics, with the primary goal of completing them as quickly as possible to get the student to the practical test. Option C. Design a syllabus that focuses heavily on theoretical knowledge and simulator training, with minimal emphasis on practical flight exercises, assuming the student will gain sufficient experience during solo flights. Option D. Develop a syllabus that outlines all required knowledge and flight training areas as specified by the FAA, breaking them down into logical lesson modules with clear learning objectives, incorporating practical exercises for skill development, and establishing a system for documenting and reviewing student progress against these objectives after each lesson. The correct answer is D. Develop a syllabus that outlines all required knowledge and flight training areas as specified by the FAA, breaking them down into logical lesson modules with clear learning objectives, incorporating practical exercises for skill development, and establishing a system for documenting and reviewing student progress against these objectives after each lesson. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a flight instructor in developing a comprehensive syllabus for a new student pilot. The challenge lies in balancing regulatory compliance, pedagogical effectiveness, and individual student needs to ensure safe and proficient pilot development. Careful judgment is required to create a structured yet adaptable training program. The correct approach involves developing a syllabus that is structured, progressive, and incorporates practical exercises aligned with regulatory requirements for pilot certification. This approach ensures that all essential knowledge and skills are covered systematically, allowing for effective tracking of student progress against established learning objectives. Regulatory frameworks, such as those outlined by the FAA for Part 61 or Part 141 flight schools, mandate specific areas of training and proficiency that must be addressed. A well-developed syllabus, broken down into organized lessons with clear objectives and practical application, directly supports compliance with these regulations by providing a roadmap for achieving the required competencies. Furthermore, incorporating practical exercises and a robust progress tracking mechanism allows the instructor to identify areas where the student excels or struggles, enabling timely adjustments to the training plan to ensure mastery of skills and knowledge, which is ethically paramount for student safety and competence. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on covering the minimum regulatory requirements without considering pedagogical principles or practical application would fail to develop a truly proficient pilot. This approach risks superficial learning, where the student may pass the check ride but lack the depth of understanding and practical skill necessary for safe operation in diverse conditions. It also neglects the importance of progressive learning and skill integration, potentially leading to gaps in the student's overall competency. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness, rushing through lessons without adequate practice or reinforcement, is also professionally unacceptable. This directly contravenes the ethical obligation to ensure student safety and competence. Such an approach increases the risk of the student developing bad habits or failing to achieve the necessary proficiency, potentially leading to unsafe flying practices or failure during the practical test. A third incorrect approach that relies on an unstructured, ad hoc method of teaching, without a defined syllabus or lesson plans, demonstrates a significant failure to meet professional standards and regulatory expectations. This lack of structure makes it impossible to systematically cover all required training areas, track progress effectively, or ensure a consistent level of instruction. It also creates an environment where learning is haphazard, and the student's development is left to chance, which is ethically irresponsible and legally non-compliant. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, e. G. FAA Part 61 or Part 141, Pedagogical Best Practices for Adult Learning, and the specific learning objectives for the pilot certificate being sought. Instructors should then design a syllabus that logically sequences learning, breaks down complex tasks into manageable lessons, and includes clear objectives, learning activities, and assessment methods. Regular review and adaptation of the syllabus and lesson plans based on student progress and feedback are crucial for effective and compliant flight instruction. Question 18. The assessment process reveals that a student pilot consistently struggles with precise airspeed control during the approach to landing. As a flight instructor, which of the following techniques would best align with regulatory requirements for effective flight instruction and student development? Option A. Focus solely on the student's ability to maintain the runway centerline, assuming that airspeed control will improve with practice on other aspects of the landing. Option B. Tell the student to just try to keep the airspeed steady, and then proceed to the next maneuver without further detailed feedback on the approach. Option C. Demonstrate the proper approach technique, explain the critical factors influencing airspeed control, allow the student to practice, and then provide specific feedback on their performance, highlighting both correct actions and areas needing refinement while acknowledging their effort. Option D. Immediately ask the student to perform the approach multiple times, pointing out every instance where the airspeed deviates from the target range. The correct answer is C. Demonstrate the proper approach technique, explain the critical factors influencing airspeed control, allow the student to practice, and then provide specific feedback on their performance, highlighting both correct actions and areas needing refinement, while acknowledging their effort. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for flight instructors, balancing the need for thorough student evaluation with the importance of fostering a positive learning environment. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing a student's proficiency while simultaneously reinforcing their confidence and motivation. A flight instructor must adhere to regulatory standards for training and evaluation while also employing effective pedagogical techniques. The correct approach involves a structured demonstration performance method, coupled with clear explanations, constructive evaluation, and positive reinforcement. This aligns with the FAA's emphasis on a systematic approach to flight instruction, as outlined in advisory circulars and the practical test standards. Specifically, the instructor should first demonstrate the maneuver, then explain its critical elements, and finally allow the student to perform it. Evaluation should be objective, identifying both strengths and areas for improvement. Positive reinforcement, such as acknowledging correct execution and effort, is crucial for student morale and retention of learned skills. This method ensures that the student understands the maneuver, can execute it safely and proficiently, and feels encouraged to continue learning. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on identifying errors without acknowledging successes. This can lead to student discouragement and a negative perception of the learning process, potentially hindering future progress. It fails to meet the spirit of fostering a positive learning environment and can be seen as a failure to adequately employ positive reinforcement techniques. Another incorrect approach would be to skip the demonstration and explanation phases and immediately ask the student to perform the maneuver. This bypasses fundamental instructional techniques, leaving the student without a clear understanding of what is expected or how to execute the maneuver correctly. This is a direct violation of sound instructional practices and regulatory guidance that emphasizes a structured, step-by-step teaching process. A third incorrect approach would be to provide vague or overly general feedback, failing to pinpoint specific areas of strength or weakness. This leaves the student unsure of what they are doing well or what needs improvement, making the evaluation ineffective. It also fails to provide the specific guidance necessary for the student to progress, which is a core responsibility of a certificated flight instructor. The professional decision-making process for such situations involves a continuous cycle of planning, instruction, and evaluation. The instructor must first plan the lesson, considering the student's current proficiency and the learning objectives. During instruction, they must employ effective demonstration and explanation techniques. Following the student's performance, they must conduct a thorough and objective evaluation, providing specific feedback and positive reinforcement. This iterative process ensures that training is effective, compliant with regulations, and conducive to student success. Question 19. Strategic planning requires a flight instructor to anticipate and address potential knowledge gaps in their students' understanding of aircraft performance. When a student asks about the practical implications of a hot day at a high-altitude airport on takeoff performance, which approach best fosters a deep, transferable understanding of aircraft performance principles without requiring complex calculations. Option A. Provide the student with the specific takeoff distance figures from the aircraft's performance charts for the current weight and a standard day, and tell them that for a hot day, they would need to consult a different chart or add a percentage to the distance. Option B. Ask the student to perform a complex calculation using the density-altitude formula and then look up the corresponding performance figures on a specialized chart, emphasizing the precision of the numbers. Option C. State that while environmental factors can affect performance, for a typical training flight, the impact is usually minor and not worth dwelling on, focusing instead on mastering basic flight maneuvers. Option D. Explain how increased temperature and altitude increase air density, thereby reducing engine power output and aerodynamic lift, leading to longer takeoff rolls and reduced climb performance, and discuss how these principles would necessitate adjustments to the planned takeoff technique and potentially the decision to fly. Correct answer is D. Explain how increased temperature and altitude increase air density, thereby reducing engine power output and aerodynamic lift, leading to longer takeoff rolls and reduced climb performance, and discuss how these principles would necessitate adjustments to the planned takeoff technique and potentially the decision to fly. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the flight instructor to balance the student's desire for a specific training scenario with the paramount responsibility of ensuring flight safety, which is directly tied to accurate aircraft performance assessment. The instructor must not only understand the theoretical impact of environmental factors on performance, but also be able to translate that understanding into practical, safe decision-making without relying solely on pre-calculated numbers. This demands a deep conceptual grasp of performance principles and the ability to apply them dynamically. The correct approach involves the instructor guiding the student to understand the asterisk principles asterisk behind performance calculations and how various factors asterisk conceptually asterisk alter performance envelopes, rather than just plugging numbers into a formula or relying on a single chart. This aligns with the FAA's emphasis on developing a thorough understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft systems, as outlined in the Airplane Flying Handbook and relevant advisory circulars concerning flight instructor responsibilities. The instructor's role is to foster critical thinking and sound judgment, ensuring the student can anticipate and react to performance changes in real-world conditions, which is a core tenet of safe aviation practice. This approach directly supports the regulatory requirement for instructors to ensure students develop a comprehensive understanding of flight principles, including performance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on memorizing specific performance chart values without understanding the underlying principles fails to equip the student for situations where conditions deviate from the chart's parameters. This is a regulatory failure because it does not ensure the student develops the necessary judgment to operate safely outside of ideal, predefined scenarios. Another incorrect approach, which dismisses the impact of environmental factors as negligible without proper assessment, is a direct contravention of safety regulations. The FAA mandates consideration of all factors affecting aircraft performance, including temperature, altitude, and wind, as these can significantly alter takeoff and landing distances, climb rates, and cruise efficiency. Failing to acknowledge and discuss these impacts is a critical safety and regulatory lapse. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance. This involves first identifying the learning objective, then assessing the student's current understanding, and finally, selecting teaching methods that promote conceptual understanding and critical thinking. In this context, the instructor should use the student's question as an opportunity to explore the asterisk y asterisk behind performance figures, discussing how changes in density, altitude, weight, and wind asterisk would asterisk affect the aircraft's capabilities, even if specific calculations aren't performed. This fosters a deeper, more transferable understanding of aircraft performance. Question 20. Strategic planning requires a flight instructor to anticipate and effectively manage a wide range of in-flight emergencies. During a simulated engine failure exercise with a student pilot, the instructor observes that the student is becoming increasingly anxious and is struggling to recall the appropriate procedures. The instructor's immediate priority is to ensure the safety of the flight and provide effective instruction. Which of the following approaches best reflects the required professional and regulatory response? Option A. Attempt to verbally guide the student through a complex troubleshooting checklist for the simulated engine failure, hoping to resolve the issue before initiating landing procedures. Option B. Focus on de-escalating the student's anxiety by discussing their feelings about the emergency, delaying the execution of emergency procedures until the student feels more composed. Option C. Continue with the lesson, emphasizing the importance of staying calm and recalling procedures, while allowing the student to work through the simulated emergency independently. Option D. Immediately take control of the aircraft, execute the appropriate forced landing procedures, and then calmly guide the student through the steps once the aircraft is safely on the ground. The correct answer is D. Immediately take control of the aircraft, execute the appropriate forced landing procedures, and then calmly guide the student through the steps once the aircraft is safely on the ground. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professionally challenging situation because it requires the instructor to assess and manage a critical in-flight emergency while simultaneously ensuring the student's safety and learning. The instructor must maintain composure, make rapid and accurate decisions under pressure, and effectively communicate with the student, all while adhering to strict regulatory protocols. The potential for loss of control, fire, or incapacitation necessitates immediate and decisive action, making the instructor's judgment paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing immediate safety by executing the most appropriate emergency procedure for the specific malfunction, which in this case is a simulated engine failure. This aligns with the fundamental principle of aviation safety: aviate, navigate, communicate. The instructor must first ensure the aircraft is under control, aviate, then determine the best course of action for landing, navigate, and finally communicate the situation if possible and necessary. This systematic approach is directly supported by FAA regulations, specifically 14 CFR 61, 195B, 2, which mandates that flight instructors must be proficient in emergency procedures and able to teach them. The instructor's primary responsibility is the safety of the flight, which includes the student pilot. Therefore, demonstrating and executing the correct emergency procedures for engine failure, such as identifying a suitable landing area and executing a forced landing, is the most critical and legally required action. Incorrect approaches analysis. Continuing the lesson as if the malfunction were not critical fails to address the immediate safety threat and violates the instructor's duty of care and regulatory obligation to teach and demonstrate emergency procedures. This approach ignores the potential for the simulated failure to become a real emergency and demonstrates a severe lapse in judgment and adherence to safety standards. Attempting to troubleshoot the simulated engine failure extensively in the air without first establishing a safe landing configuration is also an incorrect approach. While troubleshooting is part of engine failure procedures, it is secondary to maintaining aircraft control and initiating a forced landing when an engine failure is simulated or actual. This could lead to a loss of altitude or control, exacerbating the situation and potentially endangering both occupants. This deviates from the aviate, navigate, communicate hierarchy. Focusing solely on the student's reaction without actively managing the emergency is an abdication of the instructor's primary responsibility. While observing the student's response is part of instruction, the instructor's immediate duty is to ensure the safety of the aircraft and its occupants. This approach prioritizes instruction over immediate life-saving actions, which is a direct contravention of aviation safety principles and instructor responsibilities. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety above all else. This involves 1. Threat and error management (TEM), proactively identifying potential threats, simulated engine failure, and managing them to prevent errors. 2. Aviate, navigate, communicate, a hierarchical approach to managing emergencies. First, maintain control of the aircraft. Second, determine the best course of action for navigation and landing. Third, communicate the situation if time and circumstances permit. 3. Regulatory compliance, always adhering to the specific regulations governing flight instruction and emergency procedures. 4. Risk assessment, continuously assessing the risks associated with the unfolding situation and adjusting the plan accordingly. 5. Student management, integrating the student into the emergency response in a controlled and educational manner, ensuring their safety and learning without compromising the primary objective of a safe outcome.